All right, let's talk about how we're going to break down our homily today. The first part we're going to talk about is evidence. Evidence for the resurrection or the veracity, the truthfulness of the gospel accounts. So it's the evidence. Remember Dragnet, Sergeant Friday, just the facts?
Yes.
We're going to give you some of the facts, okay? Then we're going to talk about the experience. What was it like? How can we best explain what this highly unusual experience was like to see somebody who you know is dead come back to life? And then the third thing we're going to look at is the promise. What is the promise to us? What's the promise to us? Okay. Evidence. One of the first things that we look for when we are trying to prove an historical fact is that we want the text to tell us something about what happened that is real, that in some way it tells us something that we can understand. In other words, this is not a visitation from Mars. We're missing the spaceship, but we ran into Martians. This is a human experience, and I don't think anybody here has ever run into a Martian, have you? Anybody run into a Martian? If you have, you were out late last night, right? What we're going to talk, though, about is an experience that human beings did have, really, okay? The first thing we look at is this. This scene in John's Gospel, it's so revealing, because the first thing that we have to take a look at is what was the human experience that took place here. And this is very factual. John is the youngest of all the disciples, and he always describes himself as the one that Jesus loved. He calls himself the beloved disciple. He's a bragger. Yeah? He's bragging about himself. Jesus loves me best of all. And you can understand that, right? Young boy, we think he was about 16 or 17 years old, and Jesus must have enjoyed the kid, his company, having him around. And, John was flattered by the whole thing. Jesus loves me so much. So when we hear this story about the women announce that they've seen the risen Lord, they go and tell the disciples, and the disciples then decide they want to go and see what happened for themselves. Very clever here. John says, me and Peter went to the tomb. Me and Peter went to the tomb. Then he says this, but I got there first. Why? This makes sense. Peter's about 35 years old. John is 17. You ever try to run with a kid in high school? Forget about it. They're like rabbits. So he did get there first, and this is embedded right in the text. But something else he says that is even more true. He says, but I didn't go into the tomb. I waited until Peter got there. Why? Teenagers are big mouths, but they're really little people, little mice inside. He was afraid to go into the tomb. They talk big. You have teenagers? They talk big. I used to listen to some of the conversations at the high school, Newman High School. Oh boy, they talk big. Well, let me tell you something. When there's a dangerous situation, they ain't that big anymore. That's what happened here. He waited for Peter to come because he was afraid to go into the tomb. You don't want to be in a place where the women said they saw him. You don't want to go into a tomb where there are ghosts. My gosh, it's scary, ghosts. So we can see the reality. The young boy runs, he gets to the tomb. He says, I did that out of respect for Peter. Yeah, baloney. He did it because he was scared. You like that word? Remember that word we used to use as kids? I was scared. Well, John was scared. Okay? And so you have the reality of what happened that first Easter morning. Now, there is other evidence, a little bit more complicated, but scholars who are looking for proofs of what the texts say. See, we have these texts in the Bible, New Testament, that testify to the resurrection. These texts come from a tradition passed on, but only within about 50 years of the actual events. So the first books of the New Testament are around the 50, 55, and the Gospels between 60 and 90. So they're only about 50 years away from the actual event. And we have multiple attestations because we have manuscripts that are from that time period, but also we have numerous manuscripts. We have about 25,000 manuscripts in Greek and in other languages attesting to what we hear in the gospel today. Now this is fantastic because if you look at some other ancient writings, the actual authorities that wrote the text, we don't have extant manuscripts from them until hundreds, even 1,000 years later. So if you look at Homer, you look at Caesar's Gallic Wars, you look at Plato, the manuscripts that we have from them are hundreds of years after the fact, ex post facto. This is very close to the fact, and the manuscripts agree that Jesus did indeed rise from the dead. So that's the evidence that scholars look for. So we establish the fact of the resurrection. We have the evidence from the reality of the scene, and also we have the evidence from the manuscripts that we have that are only within a generation from the eyewitnesses, and these manuscripts were taking the testimony of eyewitnesses. Okay, that's the evidence. All right, now let's talk about the experience. As I said, none of us here have experienced the resurrection, right? And so, how do you understand what happened? How could you imagine what happened without having some kind of an experience that you can relate to, right? So let's give you this example. When I was a little boy, there was a woman who lived upstairs from where we lived. And her name was Grandma Krause. Grandma had come from Germany. She came from Germany. They got out after the Nazis were defeated. And she told this story, I'll never forget it. As you know, in Nazi Germany, not only were Jews persecuted and murdered in the concentration camps, but so too were priests, so too were scholars, and gypsies, and homosexuals. Her brother happened to be a scholar. He was a professor at the University of Bonn. The Nazis wanted to clear out of the universities anybody that was maybe too smart for them, who saw through the ruse of their supremacist, fascist ideology. And her brother, his name was Professor John Stott. And he fit into this category, and they swooped down one day on the university, and they took him off to a concentration camp. Now, he was the oldest of about 10 children. Grandma Krause was the youngest. And so there's a good number of years between them, maybe 15 or 20 years between the oldest brother and Grandma Krause. Now, Grandma Krause's real name was Leopoldina. We hear the name Leopold? Well, her name was Leopoldina. And she knew that her brother, she was young, maybe when they took her, maybe she was only, 5 or 10 years old, 10 years old. And she knew her brother was taken. And the family had come to believe that he was dead. Most of the time, people that were taken to the concentration camps couldn't survive. So they came to grips with the idea that their brother John was dead.
Yes.
When the war was over and the Allies released the prisoners from the concentration camps, she tells a story that she was sitting on her front stoop and she saw a man walking down the street. He looked familiar the way he walked, but she couldn't make out who it was until he called her name. Poldy, it's me. Poldy, it's me. And it was her brother. It was her brother. He came back from the dead. You read these gospel accounts. When Mary Magdalene goes out to the tomb, she sees a man. She couldn't make out who he was. She thought he was the gardener. Until Jesus says, Mary. And then she heard his voice, and she knew it was indeed Jesus. The Gospels are true. They can relate to our human experiences. We can get a taste of the joy of meeting someone who we thought we would never see again. The last example is, I suppose, someone personal, but I think all of us have something to learn. My father died in 1997. I had a wonderful father. I was very blessed. One of my brothers, who was not known to show emotion, the only emotion he ever showed was anger. And you stayed out of his way when he was angry. My father died in June, and then we had the first Christmas without him. My brother said to me, I miss him so much. If I could only see him again. I said, Peter, you will see him in the resurrection. That's the promise. But where is the intimations of this promise? Where are the intimations of this seeing our loved ones all over again? We hear it, we hope it, do we believe it? Is there evidence? There's a wonderful book came out about 10 years ago, 2015. And it's called Seeing Heaven or Heavenly Visions. It was something about heaven. And it's written by a man named John Burke. 2015, John Burke. It's about people who have had a near-death experience. Near-death experience. This is a fantastic book. It's not written by some theologian. It's not written by some novelist. It's written by a doctor who interviewed numerous people who had near-death experiences, and also psychologists and psychiatrists who verified what the people said. In other words, They said, yes, this testimony coincides with what we know to have happened. The book talks about people who have clinically died and what happened to them immediately after their death. And then these people were brought back. Brought back? No. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Brought back? Electric shock to get the heart going again. And they claimed that when they had clinically died, they saw a great light and experienced a tremendous amount of peace. And they saw Jesus. And they saw all those people that they loved during their life here on earth. And they came back to tell others of their death experience and what happened to them during the time they were clinically no longer alive. I recommend the book. I highly recommend the book. John Burke, I forget the first part of the title. It's about heaven. Imagine Heaven. Thank you. Who said that? Thank you. Great book, right? It's a great, stand up. You deserve an applause. Stand up. Imagine Heaven, 2015, John Burke. And again, another verification of what we believe about the resurrection of Jesus, what kind of experience it is for us to come in contact with someone who, and some people who we believe we would never see again because they were dead. And then once again, the promise that all those people that we saw in this life and we loved, they will meet us again in heaven. So Easter is a time of great celebration. It's a time of great hope. And it's a time of promise, because what is promised in the gospel is not just about what happened to Jesus, but it's a promise that belongs to each and every one of us. Happy Easter, and God love you.